So, like, one question I want to ask then is like, okay, so if these are really about community and experience with divinity and like
in its relationship
and not being disrespectful of the life that's given to you in the flesh and things like that. So what you're saying is you don't see this as a like this isn't something to be literally interpreted into meaning to entirely abstain from any amount of blood entering. Like what's your
if we wanted to be hyper literal, of it, you should not drink blood. That's all that this says.
Right.
The word ochel, is conjugated. The word ochel just means to consume, to eat, through your mouth.
Right.
There's different words for absorbing things differently. They've got in Hebrew. And so that's one. If we want to be totally literal, don't be a vampire.
Right.
Don't drink blood. And that's sort of what they were talking about. Don't, in worship, these other Canaanite and, other Near Eastern traditions, they were drinking the blood like the way that we would describe vampires drinking blood to stay alive, to stay young, and things like that. It's the same idea that using blood...
I didn't know that was that old of a concept.
And so, so it's... if we wanted to be literal in that sense, you should not do it. Now, if we want to interpret, right? So we're going to move away from the scripture itself and add our own modern interpretation that the Jewish tradition does not follow. So the keepers of this text, they don't follow. If we want to add an interpretation saying that you should not receive, which is a brand new word, right? Which you should not receive blood in any form or fashion. We can see that the intent of the author of these texts was not that. It was not his interpretive wish that you see these texts as a proscription against whatever this modern thing that we're doing that he had no conception of. Right?
Mm-hmm.
His was that you do not disrespect the relationship that you have with God.
Which is reasonable. It makes sense given the text.
It was that the laws that you see here are so that you are appropriately worshiping the one true God, Yahweh. And that you are not being like these other vampires, let's call them vampires,
right.
And trying to usurp the gift that God has freely given in every breath that you take. Because I want to move away from the blood aspect. The real key in these scriptures is the nefesh. Is the inbreathed life that God has given.
So the blood, that means it's...
The blood is just infused with this.
So it's not even nefesh. Really
Right, even in Genesis, if you look in Genesis 1-2, because that's where the nefesh is infused into the living creatures. So if we look at, Genesis 1:21, sorry. 1:2, 1:17. Vayivara Elohim et hataninim hagadolim va'et kol nefesh hachayim. So that right there is saying God created bara, right? God created the creatures, right? Dragons is actually another translation. The giant beasts, right? The word there, the Taninim, is actually the name of a deity in Assyria. and it's a snake deity. It's a giant beast. But that's just anyway. He's talking about God created this thing, so God is in charge. God is controlling even this. Even if you believe in this deity, God created it. This creature, and all of the living, the animated life, right? The nephesh life. So it uses the word life, and so actually in Hebrew it's hachayim. That's the actual word for life in Hebrew, and so it's got the nefesh hachayim. So the breath of life, right? And I think that in some translations that's what they actually use. The breath of life there, right? And so the nefesh is the key element there. It's being imbued. It's not mentioned here in the blood. There's no blood mentioned in this entire verse, right? But the nefesh has been given to the life. And that is actually what animates life and is given. And so another way of saying that is that God is the ground and source of all existence. That you would not have existence but for God existing, right? And God is giving freely this, whatever this nefesh is, right? There's no real translation that we can have in English of what it is. God has given that to every living creature. So everything that is life, that has the life because God is that source of the animation. And so it is all around and being imbued into the creature. And so then you have in Genesis 2 something unique happen. So the animals are created just with it. There's no clay, there's no anything like that. There's no breathing into it. The animals just have the life from creation. Humans are given that secondly, as an after point, where it's breathed in through their nostrils. And the reason I think the author does that is to convey how intimately God is involved in the life of humanity. God has to put his mouth on this creature's nose, right? This breathe life. I mean, we do that with CPR, right?
Right.
We breathe life into another person. So we take the life that God has allowed us to breathe in and breathe it into someone else so that they may live. It's the same act that God has freely given us this thing, but in an intimate way, in a relational way. So that the relationship between God and animals is different somehow between the relationship of God and humanity. And that's the point that the author is trying to get across with that. But ultimately, it all boils down to that nefesh, whatever that means, that has been given, that we can then breathe in with every breath. So every breath we take, we are reminded that God has granted us that gift. So I've gone far afield, again, from that. So my understanding, my experience is that the prescription is not against receiving blood. Receiving, it's a different word. Receiving blood. It is against the mindset of thinking that God is not a part of everything that we do. Right? That God is not gifting us daily something. We have to go worship, go into a different worship service. Right? Again, because every context that this is talking about is in worship. It's not in daily life. That in worship we sort of steal the gift instead of acknowledging that it's already given, that it's already ours.
Right.
And so that's how I would, or how I do, interpret those scriptures as that they were written down because there were a lot of pagan rituals going on at that time, and people were having a mindset that was contrary to what the message of the gospel was, which is that Christ has come freely, despite our brokenness, despite our sinfulness, and freely given something that we do not deserve. And so that's the point, is changing of the mindset. Not, a really great book that I read that really helped me realize this is, it's Soren Kierkegaard. He's written, he wrote a book called The Sickness Unto Death. And in that, he talks about the binding of Isaac. So when Abraham was going to murder Isaac, sacrifice Isaac on an altar. So human sacrifice in the Bible, right? Mm-hmm. Abraham was going to do it. And so Kierkegaard thought that was so contrary to everything else that was written in the Bible. That how could God, or how could Abraham see that he could do human sacrifice, he could commit human sacrifice, even though it was restricted. God said you should not do that. Right? But then God said, go do this. And he struggles with what that means. Does it mean, and this is what he ultimately comes to his resolution, his conclusion, is that in particular moments of a person's life, of a person's journey through faith, God prescribes different necessities. God prescribes different modes of action to fit the situation. And whatever that outcome, whatever those prescriptions are coming from God. They're not coming from this text. The things that are written down are just somebody's recollection of the way that they, in particular, experienced God, and the thing that God told them. And so, in our lives, we must, look and see, is God speaking to us in a new way? Is there a new creation? Like the Psalms say, God continually speaks in new ways to us. Mm-hmm. Is there a new way that God is speaking to us? And what is that way? And how can we respect the faith of our elders, the faith that has been passed down to us, by looking at the context and what it meant for them, and how we can apply that in our own life.
It's a very positive way to spin that story.
It is. It's a tragic story.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Okay, another question. Just while we're touching on literal interpretations and things like that, what is the consensus in general on, let's say, the Genesis account of creation as being factual within the academic community? Is there modern debate over whether or not Genesis happened, Adam and Eve happened, or how does the community see that?
Right. So, to answer the question, no, there's no debate. They don't think this is a science book.
Not even a little bit of
There's not even a little anything.
Right.
So, and it's really funny. So to flesh that out, right? Literal interpretation of the Bible is a modern invention.
Really?
It is something that was invented as a response to the Enlightenment period. Because in the Enlightenment period, for all its flaws, what it did was it rationalized and turned this into merely a history text, right? It wasn't a religious text or anything like So the Enlightenment period turned this into a history text. And so religious people, they didn't know what to do with that. Right? And so they tried to invent something to counter what was going on in the Enlightenment period. And what they had to do was say, this is the literal word of God.
My history is not, I don't remember it very well, so this is what time period when this happened?
The Enlightenment period, 1600s. So very modern in the grand scheme of things, right? And so this is a response. And so, fundamentalist literal interpretation is totally a modern response to the Enlightenment period and then the growing popularity of secular humanism and all of these other things where, as science progressed and they found out that the Earth is not the center of the universe, right? First off, that it circled the sun, so maybe the sun was the center of the universe and we were circled. They found out that no, the sun is not the center of the universe. And so slowly but surely what you have happening in science is the demotion of humanity from its special place in God's creation. Mm-hmm. And so this was a response to try and throw humanity back up at the pinnacle of creation, right? Interpretation. Now, I really like this quote. It comes from the Catholic Church, of all places, that truth does not contradict truth, right? And so the basis of that statement is that the biblical text, the purpose of the biblical text, is to just describe why human beings exist. What is their purpose? Why do we exist? What is our relationship with all of creation? The point of science is to describe how we exist. And so a why question can answer the question, why do couples fall in love underneath the light of the moon? Right? Mm-hmm. Why do human beings love? Why do human beings have these emotions? Right? And what do they mean? Science is describing how these processes work and how these particular things have happened. And so you can have things that are in parallel, describing the same types of things, but the point that what they're trying to describe is totally different. It's like the multiple voices in the text that you've got, the multiple authors describing something that's indescribable. The four Gospels, the multiple authors in the text. Science is describing a particular aspect of the universe that God has created. Mm-hmm. Right? And so in the Genesis text, in the story of creation, what you're actually finding there is a theophany. It's describing, so the person that's writing this, they're writing this well after the fact of people deciding to live in agricultural communities and cities and things like that. They've come up with writing and language. Many, Adam and Eve weren't born with the ability right now. Right. So this is many, many, many years, and so we have language that can be written down. And so they're looking back at a world, and they're trying to describe why they see what they're seeing. They're answering the question why. And so if you look in the Genesis text, there's actually two creation stories in Genesis. The first part is the priestly source, and it's describing a particular order of creation. And if you look at that order, what it does is it has the things that will hold creation in the first 3 days. And then you have the things that are put into that holding place in creation. So you have the stars, the sun, and the moon. And it's funny, light is created before the sun, right, and the moon in this particular narrative. And so you've got those things being created. And so you have the earth and all of those things, the water and all that being created first. And then you have the things to fill those spaces. So you have the birds first to fill the sky. Then you have the plants and the animals and the creeping things to fill the land. And then last, you've got humanity. This is the pinnacle. And then in Genesis 2:4 is when the second story starts. You can actually see it so clearly in the Hebrew. The words completely change the way that the verbs that are used. And so this is the Yahwist source. And so the way to describe God changes in it as well. There's a different order of creation. Humanity is created first within this order of creation. And then other things are filled in. Humanity then names those things. Right? And then Eve is created afterwards because, Adam is alone. And it's not good for all that kind of stuff. So you have a completely different order of creation because they're telling a different story. And so you can't have this be, either one of these stories be a literal story because they contradict each other in the order that things are created. And so if they can't be literal, right, because they're contradictory, so they don't jive with each other,
Right.
What do? I mean, you have to look at what the intent of the author was. The intent of the author in the first story was to actually rework some of the Babylonian creation myths so that it wasn't a pantheon of deities creating humanity, but it was a singular deity. It was the one true God creating humanity. So that was the purpose, is that instead of these divine fights, so like in the Babylonian mythos, you have Marduk and Tiamat. So that was the serpent god. They fight each other, and Marduk wins, but Tiamat represents the deep waters that are talked about in this priestly source. And Marduk throws half of Tiamat into the sky. So that's the sky waters that they talk about in Genesis, the first part. And then the deep waters underneath the firmament, right? And so that's the same story. They're telling the same story about Marduk destroying Tiamat, taking the chaotic waters, this chaotic element, Tiamat, taking control of it, subduing it, and ordering it. So ordering creation, putting things, the tohu vavohu, the chaos and emptiness, the void, empty and void, right? The elements were there, right? They were not ordered. So God is through divine fiat, instead of through battle, just speaks creation, speaks order into creation. And so that's the purpose, is to say our God is better than any other God, is able to just speak, doesn't have to fight to create.
Oh, that's what makes sense.
Right? And so they're retelling the Babylonian story to put their God in a better position.
And then the second person.
And then the second one is an older, more ancient one, the Yahwist source. God is imminent. God is getting his hands dirty, working with humanity, walking in the garden with humanity.
So that's like to make it personal.
And it's a personal God working with humanity. And then they have to, describe why things are the way they are. So you've got the etiology of why snakes don't have legs. The only creature that doesn't, according to them, that doesn't have legs, right? Well, here's the story why. This is why this particular creature has no legs, right? there's this, why is there suffering if we are so intimately connected with God? Well, here's why. And so it's again and again, it's answering the question why, not how.
Not how.
And so that's the way you can hold both of those, in tension, but no, they're really not in tension. They're just answering a different question. They're different perspectives on that elephant, right? One is describing the tail, one's describing the trunk.
It's completely rational. That totally makes sense.
And so, in scholarly discourse, you might have some fundamentalist sect or something like that try to write a paper for a peer review, but it won't get accepted into academic discourse because it's clear that that's not the purpose of these texts.
It's disprove. When you're able to sum up what's it called, the lineage of if you can do the math on the lineage of these people and things.
That's another thing too. So I'm going to stop you right there because that's another key aspect of why academics don't think this is literal. You can literally interpret this. Is that the ages that you find in this particular text differ from the other texts that we have of this by hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
And so the ages that are described in the genealogies that you've got, from Abraham to Moses and Noah and all that kind of stuff, in different manuscripts, in different ancient manuscripts, you have totally different genealogies and number of years that those individuals lived. And so this particular one is this is actually the text that we use as the basis for the Hebrew Scriptures is actually from the year 1000 CE, 1000 AD. So it's only 1,000 years old because we have no other complete texts before that time period. They've all been lost to history.
There's really?
Really. This is from the year 1000 AD.
In totality or in part?
The whole book, that's what we use for our translations into English. Now we have fragments from before that, and we have the Septuagint, but it's Hebrew that's been translated into Greek.
Right.
That's from the year 300 BC, the Greek one.
Right.
And so we can look at that. That differs by chapters.
So the date of the I always was told the date of the writing was 800 BC or something, or 1000 BC or something.
So that's when we think the originals are coming from.
Right.
But we don't have any copy that old. The oldest copy we have is from the year 1000.
Wow. That's interesting.
And so the different manuscripts that you have. Now the Hebrew text, because this is my PhD, because of the margin notes, a lot of the margin notes are type editing notes. Watch out, this looks like it's misspelled. It's not. Copy it exactly as you see it.
That's really...
Or, this particular word occurs only 3 times. This is the 3rd time.
That's kind of neat.
So these notes are just type editing. And so the Hebrew Scriptures are a lot better. They're a lot more preserved. The Christian Scriptures, there was not that tradition whatsoever. There are thousands of different manuscripts that differ drastically. And even, I don't know if they say it here in Mark, because the last few chapters in Mark, I don't know if it's part of this English translation, they'll actually point out that this is not a part of the majority of manuscripts. Woo. Woo.
What does it mean if it's not the majority of the manuscripts? That means it's literally the smallest subset of...
Right, so here it marks it. It says the shorter ending of Mark, and it ends right there. It ends with, basically on a sad note that all the disciples were afraid. They couldn't. There was terror and amazement seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, and they were afraid. And the gospel ends. There's no resolution. They don't see Jesus again. Jesus never returns in most of the early manuscripts of Mark. And so a lot of people thought that was a terrible ending to Mark. And so they added some appearances of Jesus. And you would see the last part of chapter 16 in Mark, it's all happy stories about Jesus coming back and comforting the disciples.
Right.
That's not in the oldest manuscripts of the gospel that we have. And anytime you look at so the Christian scriptures are really out of whack. They've got a lot of words off here and there. Now, the basic meaning remains the same. Right. I'm not saying that you can't trust what the English translation that you have.
Right. The
intent is there. But the specific, the literal words, if you want to follow literally, you're going to have to choose which manuscript you want to follow. Because the specific words that are being used, differ drastically in the Christian scriptures. The same is true in the Jewish tradition, but not as much. A little better. Because I've got these type of notes on the side.
That's interesting.
So does that answer your question about the Genesis story?
Yes, that's all it does. Okay, one last question. So, you're still a Christian. You're still a Christian.
I am.
You very much believe in God. How do you do it? I mean, given the fact that, we've talked about the fact that the Bible's not, a factual, scientific book, right? How do you negotiate belief in a God, which you do partially through this text, while also having this other side of you that's all right, but this isn't a factual book.
Right. So I wouldn't say it's not a factual book, but it's not a literal.
Okay, not a literal, but that's a better.
Right. It is the honest understanding of the author to the way that their community experienced God. Right? And to them, I mean, that's a fact, right? It's not maybe a scientific answering of how, but it's a why. And religion can answer the question why. It has a place to answer the question why. But to answer your question, I love the Gospel of John. The first part of it talks about what the Word is. Right? So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And the Word was God. Right? The Word was God. And all things came into being through the Word. Through God. John is talking about Christ. Talking about Jesus. Right? Jesus is the Word. Jesus is the Logos. It's the word that they use there. And so, if you think about it, Mary did not give birth to a book. Mary gave birth to a living human being that was also divinity. It was also God. Right? So, but that's it's an interpretive thing. It's not a book. And so, if I were to place this book as the literal Word of God, I would be placing it between me and God. It would become some sort of idol that's being worshipped instead of something that helps me describe the way in which I'm encountering God through my daily life, through my interactions with other human beings. And so that's how I experience God. That's how I am able to, quote-unquote, keep my religion.
So is it elevate it to a status of I'm trying to choose my word here carefully, but you don't elevate it to I don't know. Like it has this. It's a special place for you, obviously, but it's not like like what's the word for? It's not a deity, or obviously, like or an idol or anything like that. But it's not like I don't know if there's a word for it actually. But
Right.
like,
So for me, it is part. It is a tradition.
right.
I think that's maybe the word. Capital T. Tradition. It is a long line of people who have encountered God and have written that down
So when
to convey their experience.
So when you're reading it, it's more or less like people that are also undergoing something that you're undergoing, and so it's more like a community feeling, or like you can corroborate, or
We're all so we're all trying to make sense of the existence that we have, right? And as a part of my tradition that I was born into, I have this understanding of how I have a relationship with God, right? And it's one of respect, one of reverence, that my existence is contingent on the existence of this deity as a gift to me, right? So the way that I see it is that God is the existence in the universe. God is everything and all things. And so God then grants us existence within that. And so that relationship is just continually being explored and defined. And it changes just like the universe changes. As humanity grows in its understanding. And so, like for me, this is an authority, right? It is a way in which I think there are universal truths within this that are being conveyed. Because,
like human truths.
Right, human truths. Humanity. And it talks, in Genesis, it really does talk about it. It talks about humanity, Ha'adam. You know, all of humanity. The Noahide covenant. All of humanity is bound by, don't kill each other. Which is, it's a truth. Don't kill, don't murder each other. Done, right? And so it's a universal aspect, a way in which all human beings can similarly describe their experience of the divine, right? And so that's why I'm able, when I'm looking at this, to say, oh, I see this being described in similar ways in other traditions than my own, in other denominations and other religions as well. So it's the analogy that I like to use is, let's say that I am someone lost in the desert, right? And I come upon 4 buckets filled with sand and water. Right? They all have different levels of sand within the buckets, but they all have water within them as well. And so the sand is the misunderstandings that we have about our religion and the things that we need to get rid of out of the water to be able to drink and be sustained from that. And so there are a lot of people who have these different understandings and interpretations of these same texts. This is, the same text. There's so many denominations of Christianity, and it's all based on the same text that you've got. And it's like the 4 Gospels. It's all the same life of Jesus in And they're all telling a different story, but it has the same core. They're trying to describe the same thing. So that's the way I see denominations as well, is that they all see something that other people don't see. Some have, different levels of sin than others, but they all have some sort of water that can sustain life. So I guess that's how, for me, that's how I'm able to meld my academic life and my religious life. I can respect this as a historical document, and at the same time, it has religious meaning because I have similar experiences, and it's a vocabulary and a tradition that is a part of who I am.
That makes sense. Well, thank you very much for talking with us. That's good.
I hope it was helpful.
It was helpful. It actually, it's nice when this stuff actually has a rational place and not like you're kind of forced into accepting something that seems contradictory in another space place. Yeah, I think the why not how is probably
I love that. Yeah.
That's probably like the most.
I learned that in college.
That's really good. That's really good.
Yeah, I learned it in college. It was so I went to a Catholic university for undergraduate for computer science. But they had this wonderful general education program that essentially was trying to reinterpret secular humanism as Christian humanism. Right? So that all humanity has inherent worth, is what secular humanism says. Christian humanism says all humanity has inherent worth because of Christ.
Right.
Right. It has been given to us as a gift. We have worth because of this gift. And so, one of the classes, I think our sophomore year or something like that, we have to learn science. You have to learn science and stuff like that. And so, they did this lecture. Father Stang gave this lecture. He was a medical doctor in the military, chaplain. That, so he's a scientist, but also a chaplain in the military, who has come and was teaching chemistry classes at the university. And so he was teaching this particular lecture, introducing us to what we would be doing throughout the entire year. And he was helping us wrestle with that tension between science and religion that he himself had to wrestle with. And he gave this the difference between why and how. And so I've kept that ever since 98.
It totally makes sense. It totally makes sense.